So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. And I have actually been listening to a lot of the presentations while I've been waiting, and it's been a fascinating combination. And in a way, I could see connections all the way through with some of the things I'll be talking about in this presentation. The title, Teacher Competencies for Sustainability, I'll be talking about a particular project that I've been working on. Just first of all, to introduce myself, I'm working at the University of Gloucestershire in the UK. My background is in environmental and sustainable development education. Produced a couple of books with colleagues. The one in the middle actually is the latest, which is based on the project I'm going to talk about. But a lot of other authors got involved, so we had a very good sort of combination of perspectives on this idea of teacher competencies. Or I probably prefer the term dispositions, what it is that a teacher needs to do and know how they need to be in order to handle sustainable development as an issue. Now, the project I'm talking about is called Around a Sense of Purpose. I'll explain the title in a moment. Just to say, I had a number of different countries involved, non-governmental organizations and universities, chiefly academics, they were the whole thing was funded by the European Union, and the actual work that we did won quite a prestigious prize, the Green Gown Award for the Next Generation Learning and Skills category, both nationally in the UK and internationally. So it was a well-regarded project. I mentioned the title, Around a Sense of Purpose. Well, the reason we call it that is it's not, I didn't want to call it sustainable development. I feel that's a phrase that may yet pass into history as we talk about a regenerative education, maybe. The terms will always change, but what we need to be aware of is education is never for one thing. Sadly, that's not the view that is always promoted. Our own Minister of Schools back in 2015 said that the most important thing was that young people have knowledge and skills to succeed in the demanding economy. There's no question that's important, of course it is. But I think there's more to education than that for sure. And the range of issues you're raising at this conference already demonstrates that. Wouldn't it be nice if our Minister of Education in the future suggested that education, most importantly, helped us all contribute to a sustainable economy. And that way we can see that if you put that term sustainable in its broad sense, that means the environment, it means society. The economy is only a subsection of all of that. And here's a person I just thought I would just share briefly, because not because I want to celebrate this man at all. His name is Adolf Eichmann. He was responsible for organizing a section of the Holocaust that was brought about and sent in Europe in the Second World War. The reason I think of him is because I read this book about his trial, or an article by Hannah Arendt. She was a Jewish journalist and philosopher. You would have heard of her. She famously described what she saw here as the banality of evil, because what she was noticing was that Eichmann was talking about how he was diligently doing what he thought was a good job. And she said, this is not necessarily an evil man. This is a man who's not thinking about what he's doing or the purpose of what he's doing. He's actually trying to do a good job. And we all seem to be doing a good job. We've talked about many things, about health, education, about the economy, agriculture. That's all fine, but what's it all for? And if education of all things is not for protecting society and the planet, then what are we doing? Just talking about better education, more of it, more and more of it, but for what? And I think we need to ask ourselves, are we walking into something where we're all trying to talk about improving education, and yet we're destroying the planet? Not the banality of evil, but the banality of ecocide, where we actually, somebody said earlier in a talk, are we eating our own planet? And it's a very good way of putting it. So what does a teacher do faced with this? There's so many things a teacher needs to do, or maybe could be considering. And in an effort to try and define this, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe defined a number of competencies. They were published in this lovely publication. They came up with 39. I was actually a part of this group, and I was quite ashamed in a way that we ran out of time. So I felt we could get this down to a smaller number. 39 is not workable. I was a teacher. I wouldn't work with 39 competencies. It's a massive checklist. So what the project did was we refined and filtered those competencies. We thought about what they all meant, and we tested these ideas, going back to the different member countries, working with our students, with student teachers, with teachers of teachers, to try and define what were a tighter group of competencies. We boiled it down to 12. Here they are. We kept the 3 columns that UNICE used: thinking holistically, envisioning change, and achieving transformation. And we gave them all a name. So the names of the competencies are here. And we don't have time to go into them in any detail, but just to say, there is this framework now that's available globally. And what one person noticed, a Dutch teacher educator, noticed as soon as you work with one of the competencies, you start thinking about the other 11 as they got used to it. And so I thought about this. I thought that framework isn't helpful. And so what we decided to do was I'd present you with the Rounder Sense of Purpose, or RSP Palette. So as teachers, we don't tend to use resources that are given to us and slavishly follow them. We tend to use them in the way that responds to the class in front of us and the context we're in. So here are the competencies now on a palette, and the teacher can use these competencies in any combination as they teach. And so all the 12 competencies are there, and we can see that they're arranged around the palette in their groupings. The whole thing is available on our website, and the address is there, Around a Sense of Purpose, all one word, .eu. And on that website, we have the competencies linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll talk about them in a second. But each competence has a descriptor. So there's a little sentence telling you what it is. Behind each descriptor, there are 3 learning outcomes to each competence. And then there's some more underpinning components to explain more about what that competence means. And then there's examples of activities for each one. This is one from a futures competence. And as I said, these different things, each activity is now linked to each of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we've gone through the goals, through all the competencies. That's over 200 activities that you can find on that website. Just a word about the goals. Again, it's another framework with lots of boxes. And I find this not helpful to understand a sustainable world which is interconnected. Although a very useful way of describing the development goals was here from the Resilience Centre in Stockholm, where they said, look, the biosphere is underpinning everything. Those goals that refer to the biosphere are perhaps most important. Then the social ones, and then the economic ones, and then partnerships on top. This is what they call the Sustainable Development Goals wedding cake. And in a way that reflects how the world is. I like to describe it to my students as nested systems. It reflects this approach. The economy is there in the middle. Of course, it's essential. It's our home. It's transactions among us. But that can't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a society. And society itself needs an environment around it, which is infinite. So if we're not thinking about the environment as a teacher, I'm not an environmental scientist, I'm an educator, but I have to be aware that the world my students are going into is part of a wider environment. And if we don't hold those things in mind, this is going to be a problem for us all. So those competencies, just to say that they're in these 3 groups: thinking holistically, systems, attentiveness, which is where we fit a lot of the issues in, transdisciplinarity, criticality, all important things. Just an example, one of the activities, a big webbing game. We get students, or you could do this with primary school teachers, students, pupils who are working on nature. So they can then work out all those links. They can then put on a wall chart. If you are more interested in how the interconnected the world really is, well, then the codfish, just one species, has a food web that looks like this. And you can build this understanding up to notice how the world is radically interconnected. So when we learn about climate change, we start to realize that it's not just about trying to do one thing, it's doing many things. And the reason it's so important is because the world is interconnected. So we know that putting carbon in the air has warmed the atmosphere. Now we know that permafrost is melting. I've seen it myself in the Arctic, where ice cellars where Nupia Eskimos kept their whale meat over the winter or over the summer no longer work. In fact, they're flooding. We even have clathrates which is methane, sort of a slushy methane at the bottom of the ocean, bursting up because that's no longer held there as the ocean is getting warmer. And all these things are putting more methane back into the atmosphere, which is 30 times stronger than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So we are in problems here. And so we need to think about the future. We need to envision change. And so futures is a part of competence. Empathy, how does it feel to be understanding these things? And of course, creativity, and I've just had a lovely example of that from a previous speaker. Responsibility, and for a teacher, these are competencies for educators, remember. Are we actually walking the walk, walking the talk? So that's another combination of competencies that we need to consider. We shouldn't lose sight of hope. Martin Luther King famously did not say, I have a nightmare. When things were at their worst for say, people in the United States, for Black Americans who were facing a civil rights crisis, Martin Luther King galvanized support, not by saying it's terrible here, but by saying he had a dream of a better world. And so a vision of the future is a vital part of this. But that's not to say it's a blind hope. This researcher from Sweden, Maria Euler, points out that blind hope can just be a form of denial. You hope for the best, and actually it leads to inaction. What we actually need is critical hope, built on constructive understanding of the situation and acknowledging our fears and anxieties. And again, with this critical competence, teachers can better approach some of those other issues, those environmental concerns, and make those links across our lives. And lastly, you need to do something about it. So achieving transformation, participation, values, action, decisiveness is here, because it's always a dilemma. If sustainable development was straightforward, we'd be doing it now. It'd need no problem. But it's not just a technical fix. For all the wonderful technology we need to bring to bear, it's more about how we think and how we get on. And the word action, by the way, just to say on that one, it's an interesting idea. And here we use the word action competence, that term, with a very interesting definition. It has two criteria. If you just sort of have an activity as a counterweight to academic tuition, that's not an action. If you are told what to do, that's not an action. You need to decide what to do to make it action. And you also need to do it in order to solve a problem, to see change happen. And so out of those different activities you might find in a classroom, only if they meet the two criteria of the student deciding they want to do it, and they do it because they want to change something, that is action. Everything else could be a legitimate activity, but that's not action. So at the core of the framework then, we have these awareness of connections, personal, professional, environmental, and nurturing those. You have a positive vision and a critical vision of the futures, of your future, and you're making a plan about that. Just making plans is critical. It's actually good for our physical and mental health to do something. And so that's the last thing, that we actually do something with those plans, often with others, if it's all possible. And even if it seems futile, it's actually you're doing something, has a stimulus effect on others. We're social creatures, we look at each other, and that brings us back to connections, because through our actions, no matter how small, we're actually having an impact in ways we don't know in this complex adaptive system that we live in. And so I'd leave with a picture. We had a picture of a classroom earlier, and here's a typical classroom. We just need to ask ourselves, whether that's e-learning or learning on with pens and paper, is this simply an example of the banality of ecocide? Are we trying hard to pass our exams for a purpose that we have not seriously thought about? We do need to think about the purpose of education and where we are headed. And we do need teachers who kind of grasp those connections, help students through what that means, and encourage them to act for all of our sakes. So there's our palette. As I say, let's do look at the website, aroundasenseofpurpose.eu. I hope the various universities and teachers who are here can share these with colleagues. It'd be nice to think that it does get shared around the world. Just one or two maybe starting. As we see, it may be more follow. Let's get it out. So, thank you for listening.